This
Oh,
is a talk entitled Daimon Love, Plato's Symposium and Intercession.
so thank you very much, Your Eminence. So this is it seems to be sort of an emerging pattern for me that at Conclave I present two papers, one on the particular topic of the conclave, and one that's more oriented towards assisting some of our seminarians. So this is the topic paper, and as such, it's much more of a philosophical sort of approach to a question, and in fact, it's something that I've been sort of toying with for a long time. Symposium has been a significant part of my syllabi as a philosophy instructor for many years. And it's generally acknowledged that Symposium is probably the most widely read of the Platonic dialogues, aside from Republic, of course. Maybe throw in Apology, Meno, maybe the Euthyphro, but Symposium is certainly up there. I tend to reserve it actually for upper division classes, because I don't think it is an introductory text in a real sense. So upper division courses and courses that deal with the fundamental question of what it means to be human seem to be the appropriate place for working with Symposium. At Dominican University in Illinois, I've taught a class that's entitled simply Being Human. And I started from the premise that there was never one single definition of what it meant to be human, but that there were certain aspects of our humanity that called out for explication. So I started with sort of the most common sort of definition of humanity, humanity as a rational animal, right, determined by psyche, by the soul, and then sort of left that behind to look at three other approaches: eros, or our sexual being; politeia, or our social and political being; and techne, our scientific, technological, and artistic being. Symposium naturally formed the fundamental reading for the first phase of the class. I've also taught it in the context of ancient philosophy more generally, but I think it is in the exploration of the human as such that Symposium really shines as a profound inquiry into one of the things that makes us uniquely and peculiarly human, and is to say human love. I generally pair Symposium with a contemporary commentary and reading on Diotima's speech in the text, written by Franco-Belgian philosopher and psychoanalyst Luce Irigaray. That's entitled L'amour sorcier, the sorcerer love. It is itself a reading of a particular section of Symposium, but it is a great deal more than that, because it introduces themes and concepts that challenge some of the most fundamental unspoken elements of the Western philosophical tradition. Much of that challenge comes through Irigaray's notion of the daimonic, which, as we will see, is a fundamentally dialectical, fluxative and transmissive relationship that undermines the binary oppositions at the heart of Western metaphysics. The title of this presentation, Daimon Love, is actually a play on the title of one of my teacher, David Farrell Krell's most important philosophical works, called Daimon Life, in which he explores the meaning of animality as an intermediary between the world of nature and the human world. The daimon is always an intermediary, always a neither nor, a both and. And so my basic thesis here has to do with the intercessory role of the daimonic, and specifically of the daimon eros, introduced by Irigaray, rooted in Plato's diatima of Mantineia, but expanded into the realm of Christology and Christian theology. I suspect that Dr. Kupperman, who is with us today, probably has a lot to say about the idea of the daimon, because it has such an important role to play in Platonic and Neoplatonist thinking. Unfortunately, I'm going to be looking at it mostly through the lens of Irigaray's reading, rather than the tradition that sees the daimon as a more magical or tutelary force. So every time I taught this material, the question of the relationship of the human to the divine and the need for an intercessor in that relationship occurred to me. And I must have half a dozen copies of my lecture notes for Symposium, across which the word Christ with a huge question mark is scrawled. And yet I never fully explored, and still have not, what this might mean. It remained at the level of a suggestive note that I intended to return to, and never did until the thought occurred to me, as if for the first time, the next semester. So this presentation is my very first attempt to coherently work out at least some of the connections between this transmissive spirit and the root concept of the man-God Christ. I'm honestly not sure how specifically Gnostic this conception of Christ is, nor how specifically Johannite. I suspect, and perhaps this will emerge through the writing that took place, that this is at least consistent with the primitive Christian tradition that I feel is at the heart of the Apostolic Johannite Church. This is something that I mentioned yesterday in response to a question about the sort of general nature of the AJC, that I see it very much as expressing a form of primitive Christianity. And I feel that that tradition is coherently Gnostic, even if not drawn specifically from any particular historical Gnostic sect. At the very least, I feel confident that the image of Christ that shines forth in my thinking about Diotima's speech in particular is consistent with the broad strokes of the universal Christian tradition as we've inherited it. I'm not sure to what extent this question has been taken up by the philosophical literature, which I have specifically avoided in this context in order to formulate these ideas, at least in a preliminary or propedeutic way, independent of any particular sectarian interpretation, likely Catholic, that might have already been worked out by others in advance. My preliminary literature search did turn up a few references, but I don't know that there's any sustained examination. That said, my literature search was incredibly brief and very, very cursory, so I may have missed some important things. So later on, people might bring things to my attention, which will be good, because I do hope to sort of expand this with taking into account some of the contemporary scholarship. So perhaps I'm mistaken that this has not been has been taken up. And what occurs to me in the teaching of this material hasn't necessarily occurred to others, or occurred to them in the same way or with the same force. And I often find that this is the case, that something that I find very, very striking in reading a source text, simply just hasn't been mentioned and hasn't occurred to others. Irigarai's essay itself is a scholarly commentary on a canonical ancient text. However, it is, for me, so striking in its originality and persuasiveness that I am unable to think of it simply as an exegesis or a philosophical commentary, so much as a primary source in its own right. And so that's how I'm going to approach her work. It has been suggested, and I think that this is probably right, that every Platonic dialogue seeks to address the same question. The question, TST, what is something? And in the case of Symposium, quite obviously, the question is, what is love? However, it's not asked in a simple or straightforward way, such as we might see in an early dialogue like the Euthyphro, where the question is, what is piety? And certain possibilities are laid out. In fact, I would argue that Symposium has a great deal in common with later dialogues like Timaeus and Statesman, despite features that allow it to be fairly confidently placed chronologically among the middle dialogues, in which Plato begins to speak positively and coherently in his own voice. Rather than presenting only a negative approach, such as we see in the early dialogues, or a monolithic conception of love, such as we would see for justice in Republic, Symposium presents an account of love that seems to oscillate between different extremes, whilst becoming more comprehensive at each step. And that culminates in the idea of love as a spiritual force that transcends the binary structures of the emerging Platonic metaphysics in Socrates' speech. Though it's important to note that Socrates does not speak, as it were, of his own accord, but transmits the speech of Diotima, and thus takes on the role of intermediary himself. My fundamental thesis is that love acts as an intercessory conduit between the human and the divine, and that this conduit is personified in the man-God Christ. To this extent, and I hope to build on this in the presentation, new meaning or more profundity is added to the radical statement that God is love in the first letter of John, in which the writer elucidates the role of Christ as mediator with the family. So with the Father and with the Trinity. So at this point, I think it's necessary to give something of an account of what's going on in Symposium in general, and in Diotima's speech in particular. So this dialogue, I have to admit, is one of my favorites, not least of all because, well, it's a drinking party, and the members of the Symposium get progressively sloshed over the course of the evening, all except, of course, for Socrates, who remains completely intact, and when everybody else is passed out on the floor and Alcibiades has come crashing into the party, sort of goes off to start his day as the sun comes up. But it also has one of the more unique frames of any of the Platonic dialogue. It begins with a conversation between Apollodorus, who was a student of Socrates, and a handful of unnamed companions. And the story goes from the original participants, including Socrates and the rest, and including Aristodemus, who relates the story to Apollodorus, who tells his story to his companion, and thus it is transmitted to us. So we've got transmission as part of the story. It's a story of transmission, double genitive. And when it comes to Socrates, when it's his turn to speak, he doesn't even speak in his own name, but as I've mentioned before, he transmits the speech that Diotima gave long before. So there are frames within frames within frames. And this is not a mistake. This is not unintentional. Plato is a good enough writer that we can be relatively sure that when he does something, especially when he does something kind of weird, that he's doing it on purpose and that there's something important going on. So built into the very structure of the dialogue is this problem of transmission. Now, the events that are described here would have taken place if we assume that there is at least some factual basis for the dialogue, which naturally is very much in question, in 416 BC. We know that with some certainty because that's the year in which Agathon first wins the Greater Dionysia, and that's what's being celebrated at this symposium. It's sort of a big deal, right? The symposium is being held to honor Agathon, who's sort of just won the Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor, all wrapped up into one. And we know that this is important because Socrates has been invited, and as somebody notices, he's wearing sandals and has gone to the public baths, which I think tells us a lot about Socrates, that it's a red letter day because he's put on some shoes and taken a fucking shower. So a number of people are invited, including Socrates and Aristophanes, the great comic poet. But there is one very interesting character who is excluded from, kicked out of the party right at the beginning. She's a flute girl, and she's sent off mainly because these manly men are going to discuss some manly topics, namely love. But I would argue that the exclusion of the female is, as it were, rectified by Socrates when he speaks and, as it were, invites the feminine back in the form of Diotima, or at least her words. But of course, she appears not in the flesh, but as a kind of trace. And this seems to me to be essential to the theme of transmission. And for Irigaray, transmission is intimately tied to fecundity. So these men are going to discuss love or sing songs in praise of love. And they're going to take turns praising love, because while there are great songs to praise all of the gods, Eros seems to have been largely passed over. So each speech that's given turns this idea of love just a little bit. Phaedrus, who has his own dialogue, of course, is the first to speak, and he gives a fairly prosaic account of Eros as an ancient primordial god, in keeping with the account given in Hesiod, in which Eros, Chaos, and Nyx, I think, are the first to emerge on the scene, first out of the Orphic world egg, as it were. But it is from here on that love becomes more problematic. I don't want to try to give an account of all of the speeches, but I do want to mention two in particular, in addition to Diotima's speech. These are the speech of Pausanias and the speech of Aristophanes. Pausanias introduces a distinction between Eros Urania, the heavenly love, and Eros Pandemos, the vulgar or common love, Following up on Bridget's presentation, you guys have gotten more Greek than you ever wanted. So these eroi are in attendance to Aphrodite, who is similarly doubled. So there's an Aphrodite Uranius and an Aphrodite Pandemos. The heavenly Aphrodite is literally the child of the heavens. She is the child of Uranos. And we aren't told who her mother is. So she seems to appear strictly from the male line. And for Pausanias, this is going to be particularly important because Pausanias is always going to privilege the homoerotic masculine kind of love over procreative or heterosexual love. On the other hand, the younger, vulgar Aphrodite is the child of Zeus and Dione. That is to say, she's the product of a relatively straightforward sexual union, insofar as one can say that the sexual union between primordial gods is straightforward. But it sets up a very basic kind of dichotomy. There's heavenly love that is good and beautiful, and there is vulgar love that is dirty and sexual and physical. And there is very much a kind of proto-Manichaeism being set up, or rather, the Manichaeans inherit from their Gnostic predecessors the sharp horizontal dualism of Platonism. That's indicated here in the speech of Pausanias. In a contemporary Greek context, this is a criticism of the abuse of the institution of pederasty. It's not so much a criticism of the institution of pederasty, because that's being seen as increasingly vulgar and sexualized. But for Pausanias and the other men at the Symposium, it is an institution that serves a really vital educational and political function. But it's become corrupted. This spiritual love has been reduced to purely physical love. To this extent, I think that Pausanias is talking about love in a fairly modern way, because I think we make a distinction between a profound and intimate love and just hooking up, even if both have a sexual component to them. But more importantly, this speech represents our basic binary thinking. Binaries like the temporal and the eternal, the finite and the infinite, the body and the soul, the female and the male, the dishonorable and the honorable, the secretive and the public. All of these are built into the fundamental structure of metaphysics. So Pausanias sort of lays that out in a straightforward way. Now, Aristophanes ought to be the next one to speak, although he gives up his turn to the physician Eryximachus because Aristophanes has the hiccups. And actually, there's a strange little interlude, which I love, in which Eryximachus, being a physician, suggests a number of treatments for hiccups. And I think that everybody has their own sort of treatment for hiccups. Forgive this very strange digression. My friend Vic, God rest his soul, used to carry around packets of sugar with him, and if he got the hiccups, he would just swallow a packet of sugar. I will take 10 quick sips of water. My wife has this bizarre process in which I have to sort of plug up her ears and her nose, and she blows real hard and drinks water. But they all seem to work perfectly. So this has a long tradition. However, when he has recovered and it is his turn to speak, he gives the very famous myth of the androgynous origins of the human race. And in this myth, he suggests that human sex was not originally binary, but ternary. So there's a middle course that ultimately may be identified with love. which enables us to transcend the binaries that have been set up by Pausanias, Plato more generally, including the distinction, the binary, between the mortal and the immortal. The myth of Aristophanes, myth of the androgyne, is likely familiar to many of you, but I'll recount it anyway. Human beings originally are a sort of round creature with 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces. And they're powerful, they're quick, and they don't need sexual reproduction because they procreate upon the earth. And there are 3 separate sexes. There is a male, a female, and an androgyne, or neuter. Now, obviously, what we're meant to picture here are 2 human beings sort of welded together, right? The male being a male-male couple, the female being a female-female couple, and the androgyne being a male-female couple. He also associates these with the male is solar, the female is terrestrial, and the androgyne is lunar. So these primordial human beings, these round creatures, they decide that they are going to storm heaven, that they're going to roll their way up to Mount Olympus and challenge the gods, which ultimately seems to be a fairly common and peculiarly human pastime. Now, Zeus, in particular, doesn't want to simply annihilate them, but he can't let them run rampant either. So he punishes them by splitting them in 2. So each being is divided into 2 separate beings. Now, strangely, this division reduces the 3 sexes to 2. The original form of the human being would have been these 2 people fused together. So now there are merely the 2 sexes of male and female. The androgyne is lost. So now each of these halves, of which we are examples, is suddenly wandering around looking for its original partner. And they're all a bit of a bloodied mess for having just been cut in half. Apollo cleans us up a little bit. He turns our faces around and sews up the wound, tightening it up in the middle and tying it off in a knot at the navel. But these 2 halves keep seeking each other out, and they begin to die of hunger because they're so obsessed with their mission to reunite themselves. And Zeus doesn't want this because he doesn't want the human race to die out, because that will deprive him of the sacrifices and honors that he craves. So he takes a certain pity on us and changes the way that we procreate and introduces sexual procreation as a way for us to have a kind of temporary reunion with our other halves. That love is a way in which this primordial state, this androgynous state in many cases, is simulated. And I think, of course, that this is the origin of, or at least it's a part of the same discourse as finding one's soulmate. I admit I despise the idea of a soulmate, the idea that there's only one person out there that is your perfect match. I think that's kind of nonsense. But it is nonetheless a pervasive sort of idea, and certainly not a new one. So love is a way to restore what has been lost, to overcome the binary, even though it is in itself a reminder of our inherent fallenness. Love is the path to our primordial perfection. So this really challenges the binary thinking of Pausanias and sets up a certain dialectical thinking that takes place in Socrates or Diotima's speech. So that brings us to what I think is really the culmination of the dialogue, which is the speech of Diotima. So who is she? She is, first of all, a woman, and that is striking in and of itself. Although Socrates acknowledges that he has learned at the feet of women in other cases as well. Aspasia teaches him rhetoric. But Diotima has a much more important role to play. She is the one who's going to initiate Socrates into the mysteries of love. Now, we don't really know anything about Diotima as an historical figure. We don't even know if she really was an historical figure. And yet she exercises an extraordinary pull on philosophers. In the late 18th and early 19th century in particular, German romantics and idealists, people like Hölderlin, Schelling, von Schlegel, Novalis, became fascinated with this character of Diotima. And I think in part because they intuited that she represented a challenge to the, at that point, fully ensconced metaphysics of the last 2,000 plus years of Western philosophy. But even her name and provenance are intriguing. Her name literally means honor to the gods, or one who honors the gods. And we're told that she comes from Mantinea. Now, Mantinea is very much a real place in Arcadia. But the inclusion of this detail allows Plato to introduce some fairly sophisticated Greek wordplay. Right? The name of the city evokes mantikos, divination or prophecy. We can see this in all of our English words that end with the suffix mancy, right? So cartomancy, bibliomancy, and necromancy. So there's a play upon her origin, but the pun is a double pun because mantikos in turn also evokes mania or madness. So there's a lot that's going on just in her name. And again, I think that when Plato introduces something a little bit strange like this, we can be certain that he's doing it on purpose and that there's something important that's being marked off here. She's described as a kind of epopt, a prophetess, an initiatrix, who teaches Socrates something sacred. And the language that's used is very much that of the Greek mystery schools. So clearly, she's somebody that Socrates holds in the highest regards. He thinks of her as one of his most important teachers. So instead of singing a song in praise of Eros, he's going to relate this conversation that he had with the priestess of Eros. Now, this happened some time ago because Socrates describes himself as a young man. It could mean he's 30, but you can tell that he's very young in the story because he says a bunch of really stupid things. Normally, when we read a Platonic dialogue, at least the early dialogues, Socrates is always the one who has knowledge. He's the one who's going to be able to lead us, if not to truth, at least to the moment of aporia, right? Of being resourceless, of being out to sea. But in the middle and later dialogues, this isn't always the case. And we can see here that the young Socrates makes some fundamental errors. Diotima tells Socrates that love is neither beautiful nor good, which is really quite a striking claim, because up until this point in the Symposium, anybody who's been speaking has been praising Eros and saying how important he is and how ancient he is and how good and how beautiful and how powerful he is, how he walks upon the heart and is one of the first of the primordial gods. But Socrates starts with a premise that he is neither good nor beautiful. So naturally, the young Socrates immediately falling into a kind of unthinking binary, says, do you mean to say that that Eros is ugly and evil? And it's here that Diotima does something really extraordinary. She laughs. She laughs at Socrates. But as Intercessory suggests, there's no derision or anger in that laughter. But nonetheless, it's pretty clear that Socrates has missed the point. Diotima tells him that Eros is neither good nor bad, neither beautiful nor ugly, but is instead the mediator between these. Love isn't beautiful because love loves the beautiful. Therefore, it has to lack the beautiful. It wants to get it. However, it's not completely deprived of the beautiful because it has enough of it to know what it wants. And it's therefore in the middle. It functions as a third term, which is itself striking because the whole of Platonic metaphysics seems to be rooted in exclusive and universal binaries. For example, if you look at book 7 of, I guess actually the end of book 6 of Republic, the structure of the divided line, the fundamental division is between the visible and the intelligible. Now, there is nothing that is neither visible nor intelligible. There is nothing that is both visible and intelligible. So those are completely exclusive, and yet they are all-encompassing. So there's no room in these sort of traditional readings of Platonic metaphysics for third terms. But Diotima goes further. She challenges the speech of Phaedrus that begins with the assertion that Eros is a great god. Diotima says that Eros isn't even a god at all, but that rather he is a daimon, spirit. Neither a god nor a mortal. Eros is not a god because he desires, and to desire is to lack. But he's not mortal either. He's not subject to death. He is a daimon. Now, this is a particularly important idea for Socrates because he often talks about his personal daimon, this tutelary spirit, this voice of conscience that communicates the will of the gods to him. In Plato's version of Apology, it's very much the voice of conscience telling him what not to do. However, in Xenophon's version of Apology, it's quite clear that the daimon is a prophetic voice that tells the will of the gods to Socrates. It's his discourse, Socrates' discourse of the daimon, that's partially responsible for him getting in trouble with the Athenians in the first place, because he's accused of introducing the worship of false gods. So according to Diotima, Eros is neither a god nor a mortal, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither good nor evil. He is a medium, a transmitter, something that stands in the middle between mortals and gods. He is a sort of angel, an angelos, a messenger. When Gabriel shows up to announce to the Blessed Virgin that she's going to give birth to the Christ child, he acts as a messenger, as one of the angeloi. So when we talk about these daimons, there's something hermetic about them, right? That they're about communication. They're about having a kind of dual nature. They travel between the world of the gods and the world of humans. So when we're talking about divination, prophecy, mantikos, this is exactly what we're talking about. So the significance of Diotima's name comes to the fore here. And it's in this context that the idea of Christ as mediator occurred to me in the teaching of this dialogue. already something is coming together. So where does this Daimon come from? What is his provenance? Who are his parents? And Socrates has a story to tell here. And I always insist to my students that when Plato really wants you to understand something, not only does he present the argument to you, but he also gives you a myth. And like Aristophanes, he's going to present an origin myth. The origin here, though, is the origin of love. Eros is always associated with Aphrodite. Pausanias makes that clear from the beginning. And the same story is told here, but in a different way. To celebrate the birth of Aphrodite, the gods do what the gods do best. They throw a party. And everyone has been invited. All of the gods have been invited, with one really important exception. And I think that this again speaks to some of the gender issues that are raised in the dialogue. The exception is Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, the goddess of the home. She has to stay and tend the hearth. So again, the female is excluded, much like the expulsion of the flute girl. But there seem to be even a fair number of minor divine personages that are hanging about, including Poros, the son of Metidos. And Metidos means cunning. It's related to Metis, one of Zeus's first wives, right? Metis is the one who foresees Zeus's overthrow, and so Zeus, clearly not paying attention to the family history, eats his wife. So in some sense, she is the mother of Athena, who then is born fully armed from the head of Zeus. Metis means thoughtfulness or cleverness. And so Poros partakes of this quality. He is the clever one. He is the god of ingenuity. He's infinitely resourceful. But also hanging around the party is penia, or poverty. It's the root of our English word penury. So there's this unlikely sort of pairing of resource and ingenuity and poverty. Now, of course, Poros is inside the party, getting roaring drunk, and stumbles outside where Penia is sort of lurking around the doorway. And she contrives, wonderfully ironically, since Poros is, of course, the god of contrivance, to take advantage of him. And she renders him helpless. Aporos. Right? So Poros becomes aporos. Poros reaches a kind of aporia. So there's a bit of a role reversal going on here, as it were. In doing so, she conceives Eros. So Eros is the child of Poros and Penia, the child of resource and poverty. And he bears the hallmarks of both of his parents. Conceived as he was at the birthday celebration for Aphrodite, he's always searching after beauty, though he can never possess her. Like his mother, he is poor, not tender or sweet, shoeless, homeless, sleeping in doorways. He dwells in lack. But he's also like his father. He's clever, scheming, impetuous, high-strung, a master of jugglery and witchcraft. Eros is, in a word, streetwise. Like the philosopher, love is always on a quest. Love is the lover of beauty, just as philosophers are the lovers of wisdom. But the philosopher isn't wise. I'm living proof of that. The philosopher desires wisdom, and we desire only what we do not have. But the philosopher is at least wise enough to know what he doesn't know. And Eros has enough of the beautiful to know what he wants. Love is always a love of the good, the love of beauty, the love of wisdom. Which means that throughout this whole dialogue, we've been looking at love the wrong way round. We assumed that love is the beautiful, But love is precisely what lacks the beautiful, but makes its way toward the beautiful. Eros is neither human nor divine, but partakes of the qualities of both. Like the gods, he is immortal and eternal, and like humans, he is finite and lacks what he desires. Thus, love is precisely a love for the infinite, the desire for eternity, the desire for immortality. And it is through love that we have contact with these things. Love is always a medium. It's not the good or the beautiful or the divine, but our way toward it. One of the most famous elements of the speech of Diotima is the so-called ladder of love. Love, even the love of just some particular person, even sexual love, is on its way to the highest forms of love. It's on the way to love itself. We ascend, as it were, step by step from the love of the particular body to the love of all beautiful bodies, to the love of the soul, the love of the city, the community, the love of truth and knowledge, and finally we ascend to divine love itself. So love is the means of our ascent to the divine world. Now, it is at this point in the dialogue that Alcibiades comes crashing in, roaring drunk, throws everything upside down, but that is a story for another time, as one says. There's a great deal in this story which points to a Christological interpretation of this daimon called love. Not merely the idea of love as an angel or messenger, a hermetic conduit with one foot in the world of the divine and one in the human one, but more profoundly that love is of a double nature, the primordial man-God, and thus the archetype of Christ the Redeemer. It is through imitation of Jesus, the man, that we ascend to the love of community, the ecclesia, the love of humanity itself, and thus ascend to the God who is love. And I don't think it's accidental that these images should pertain so much to John's contributions to the canonical Greek Bible, as there is much in this mythology that speaks to John's imagistic, mythological, and prophetic engagement with the world. Of course, I am, to a certain extent, conflating the John of the Fourth Gospel, the John of the Epistles, the John of the Apocalypse, maybe even John of the Apocryphon. So my hope is that you will forgive this much too facile synthesis. Christ is a daimon, but rather than being neither divine nor human, he is both divine and human. But I think we've suggested, as we've suggested with our theme here, Christ is not only our medium, our intercessor. The spirits and saints whom we invoke are in their own way a manifestation of that love, which is the path to the ground of all being. Like the Blessed Virgin, like Jesus, they stand in the middle between the divine realm and the merely human. But they do so by being both rather than neither. The saints are human, in some cases all too human, but they line the road to the salvation that we call gnosis through their own attainment and through acting as intercessors on our behalf. That is to say, in an act of love. Irigarai's reading of Diotima's speech draws many of these themes into more precise focus by emphasizing the dialectical nature of the relationship of love, lover, and beloved. It is true love that we have a glimpse of. It is in true love that we have a glimpse of an engagement with being that preserves rather than opposes becoming. Because love is in constant movement rather than being simply static or monolithic. Diotima's response to Socrates' authoritative claims that eros must be one thing or another is not anger or ridicule, but a kind of loving laughter that opens a space for Socrates to enter into the domain of love, which is not fixed but fluid because it is daimonic. It is transmissive. It is love that bridges the gap and allows there to be contact between the athanatoi, the gods, and the thnetoi, human beings. It allows us to enter into this relationship with the divine in dreams and in magic. Love is therefore fundamentally initiatory. It is the realm of divination, of priestly knowledge, of sacrifices, initiations, incantations, preaching, and sorcery. It is the path of the initiate's journey, the desire for ever-increasing light. Love is the possibility of immortality, the promise of initiation. When we speak of immortality, we don't mean merely longevity. Longevity is an extension of time. I always think of Woody Allen's very famous quote that he didn't want to be immortal through his work. He wanted to be immortal through not dying. Immortality is the presence of eternity. Irigaray calls this, quote, the presence of immortality in the living mortal, calls this presence fecundity. It is the very possibility of growth, which is always in motion, never at rest. The union of love is fecund by its very nature. It is only secondarily procreative. It is harmonic, and thus a mirror of divine cosmic harmony. In Irigaray's reading, this fecundity is the passage to immortality. The beautiful creates harmony, whereas the ugly hoards fecundity. Again, this is not immortality through procreation or even through creativity. Immortality for Irigaray is the precondition of procreation. Procreation doesn't produce immortality. Love is the intermediary, not the goal or product of the union of opposites. However, precisely when Socrates is on the verge of this revelation, he makes the same mistake at 53 years old that he did as a young man. He slips back into thinking in binaries. In doing so, he runs the risk of falling prey to this metaphysics that is just getting set up, in Irigaray's words. Diotima's erotic, daimonic dialectic is an antidote to this, because it insists on fecundity of both body and soul, and not merely of the soul at the expense of the body. The mystery of the incarnation is that Christ is not merely divine, but also human. He restores the unity of the human and the divine through love. And if we draw together two of the most famous passages from the Johannine contributions to the Greek Bible, we see in the first letter of John, which emphasizes the importance of the incarnation of the Son, that God is love. Love is from God. This is God the Son, who is sent from the Father in an act of love. Now, when we draw these threads together, it makes sense with the passage from chapter 14 of the fourth gospel, that no one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known the Father. So what is the message here? It is simply this: we cannot know the ground of all being except through love. Love is the daimonic medium, Christ the intercessor, by which we come to the ultimate ground of all being. It is via this medium that we attain to immortality, not in the future, as a promise assured after death, or as the continued existence of our progeny, but as living beings, partaking not of longevity, but of eternity. But what we attested to through love is precisely knowledge of the Father. That is to say, the gnosis of God. The elaborate structures of the aeons of the classical Gnostics were an attempt to express this moving intermediateness that we call love. Like Plato, I think they glimpsed this fundamental initiatory truth, but only as through a glass darkly, and expressed it as best they could. So it seems to me that ultimately the insight here is both specifically Gnostic and specifically Johannite. The Christ event occurs as an act of love, a manifestation of love. That is to say, the very possibility of immortality, the condition of initiation, and the mechanism of gnosis. The new commandment in John 13 is that we should love one another. And it is through love of the other, the welcoming embrace of God manifested as a community of love, that we attain through the man God Christ to the ultimate gnosis of immortality. Thank you very much. I'm open to some questions now. How are we doing on? We're good on time.
Yeah, we're doing good. I was just gonna have a comment because, as you know, my famous Achilles heel. I mean, my famous Achilles heels where it comes to heels plural, where it comes to pretty much anything is mathematics, astrology, and philosophy, right? And I can't decide which one I'm worse at. But every time I attempt any of those things, it ends poorly. But particularly in kind of your capstone, there was something that said much better than the way I said it, and perhaps there's some overlap here that you'll be able to discern that I won't. But we had a discussion once, and I think this was in our Martinist Lodge, about love as kind of the means, access point, and result, type of thing, being not only the end point, but kind of the way to initiation. And I used it kind of with the terms that I'm familiar with, of course, going to stuff like Hesychus thought, like Gregory Palamas, and the idea that there's a distinction between kind of essence and energy, to use the dumbed down English terms, right? Like if you know the sun directly, to know the sun directly is to be incinerated, right? But you can feel the warmth of the sun on your head. And can you really say can you really say you do not know the sun at that point in time? And that anything that has that kind of experiential relational thing is a kind of way in, plus the thing that it produces. And it always seemed to me that the most obvious example of that type of thing would be love, right? And so, like I'm glad to hear somebody smarter than me articulate a similar point with a lot more depth. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? There is a lot more that could be explored here, honestly. And one of the, I think, most important things that can be explored here is the gender dynamic. Because there is the sort of first association in Symposium with love is something masculine, love is something purely masculine, that any kind of love that's got an admixture of femininity is somehow dirty or vulgar. And I think Socrates really tosses that on its head. And so there's something very feminine about this love, or at least the feminine is reintegrated into it. And I think that this is really consistent with our sort of conception of the divine feminine, that the Christ event is not restricted to a particular sex or gender, and that the Godhead is not limited by sex or gender. So I think in some ways this flows quite nicely from Bridget's talk. I always have the misfortune of following up brilliant women at my conclave talks. I'm starting to think that you're setting me up, Your Eminence. So last year it was Angie, and I felt like an oaf following Angie. So this year it's Bridget.
I was going to say, speaking of Angie, because I think it was a talk either last year or the year before, talking about Bernadette Roberts' kind of conception of Jesus versus Christ, et cetera, and that Christ is the point where kind of humanity, meets the divine, represent, is the kind of, stand-in for what happens when the two comes together. And Angie can chime in to tell me my summary is crap, because it probably is. But
I will always stand on the box to sing about Bernadette Roberts, but you are not wrong.
Okay, so
that's a first.
So the kind of taking the ball from Roberts and kind of running it, that Christ is the principle, or perhaps archetype, prototype, whatever you want to say, of kind of that human divine kind of interface. When you look at it, if you make the distinction, and we've had this in talks about liturgy, because we use terms throughout liturgy for different purposes, right? You'll see logos here, you'll see Christ there, and you'll see Jesus over here, right? And that anytime we're using anytime we're using those, there's a reason why we use one over the other at a given point in time. And it just would seem to me that kind of going with what you said, that Christ is kind of the best exemplification of that, I guess, at least in terms of our own kind of worldview, right?
And I think that the so-called ladder of love, and actually it's strange, because that's often what people focus on in Diotima's speech, is the ladder of love, the movement from the love of the particular boy, right, to the love of beautiful bodies generally, to the love of the community, to the love of truth and justice, up all the way to the form of love. I don't think that that's the most important part, but I think that it illustrates something really important, that something as simple as the imitation of Jesus, right, is as much an expression of that Christ nature as any high Christology.
Yeah.
They're on the same, they're part of the same thing. And so, speaking as somebody, who's always a lot more interested in Christ than I am in Jesus, this is a good sort of antidote to that, because it's a reminder that those are on a continuum rather than separate sort of events. So I think that maybe Diotima's speech gives us some tools that we can use to talk about that.
Well, I think that tracks with, ye old dusted off, kind of Raymond Brown's conception of the Johannite successionists, right? The idea that, it's the incarnation, not the crucifixion, that is the salvific event, right? That idea where, humanity and divinity, I guess, and now I'm taking it much further than he would, become so identified or so, whatever, that there's no distinction. And that thing, that kind of that type of union, like, yeah, exemplified in the man Jesus type of thing, but that Christ kind of singling that out between kind of the logos and the man, right? That Christ type of thing is the I guess kind of the degree to which you must love, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right? It has to be so total, right? And you know what I mean? And only Christ, rather than the logos or Jesus, only Christ kind of nails that kind of sense of scale.
Nice choice of words.
Sorry. Yeah.
I've always held that the great sacrifice of Christ is not the crucifixion, it is the incarnation. That's the moment where Christ sacrifices, because what he sacrifices is the pure divinity. I see Jason's got his hand up, so he's going to save us from this blather.
Oh no, I'm just going to ask for more of it. I guess this is one of those conclave things, not a question, but a statement.
Why haven't we read your book? Is that the... No, that's usually my question.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
I'll post the links in the chat. No, I'm kidding. I've always had this feeling of a connection between this sort of my experience of like an apophatic, ineffable, like inexpressible divine being, ground of being. Gnosis as this sort of experience of brushing up against that, and love as perhaps a both less charged and more complex term to describe a similar experience or the same experience, levels thereof, that kind of thing. So I want to just thank you for diving deeper into what that connection is and teasing out more material that I can continue to look at and engage with on it. And then I also just want to say, as a non-churchy Gnostic, this kind of thing helps me connect more with interest in Christian approaches that don't inherently speak to me. Like they don't, like I'm not a rebellious anti-Christian. It's more like I'm like a guy that someone takes to a Star Wars movie that then says, I don't get it. What are you guys all so excited about? So this helps me understand that a bit more.
Excellent. I think you're absolutely right. And I love this image of gnosis as brushing up against the ineffable. I think that's a wonderfully poetic, very evocative image. So, and Ed's got a question as well.
Yeah, I learned how to virtually raise my hand, so now I can't be rude and just butt in.
I know that. Isn't that the coolest thing, though? So
is it? Now I have to figure out how to turn it off when I'm done. So, quick question. I'm trying to remember the story of Diotima, and that's the philosopher is the one who pursues wisdom, who loves wisdom. Correct?
Right.
And in terms of gender, we would normally present Sophia or view Sophia as being feminine or female, as not necessarily a goddess, because that word isn't really ever used in our mythology, but something very similar. How is she presented in if it is a she, is my point. Like, how does Diotima present wisdom?
So Diotima, Diotima, I don't think makes explicit the jump from the lover of beauty to the lover of wisdom. I think that's more something that Iragai does, but I have to double check the text. I could very well be wrong there. Okay. It's actually, I have to admit, it's been a while since I've read the text. So Iragai is the one who sort of, I think, picks up on that and makes something of that. So Iragai, as a modern thinker, isn't necessarily, she's not thinking in Greek in quite the same way. So I don't think Sophia, as this kind of feminine presence, is sort of taken up explicitly. But I think your question raises a really important question, because both beauty and wisdom are gendered in some way for the Greeks, right? Whether it's Aphrodite or Sophia. And so the object of love is always something feminine, which is peculiar for these Greeks, for whom the highest expression of love, at least according to people like Pausanias, is the love of the man for the young boy, right? Is this pederastic love. So I think that there are really interesting inversions that are going on in there.
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of comparing it to my obsession, the Gospel of Mary, where the instructor is presented as female. And it's very interesting because instead of instructing and teaching her class through laughter like Diotima does, she teaches her class through her tears and her being upset, her more negative emotions. And the thing that she teaches folks to pursue isn't wisdom or anything that we would really give a gender to. It's not necessarily gender essential, and that is rest. The height of the soul ascent is rest, which I have met many women who would tell me that that's what they're pursuing. They would just like to get away from men.
Yeah.
So I can kind of see that, but on a more metaphysical level, it's interesting that I'm hard pressed to assign a gender aspect to that. Anyway,
Yeah,
just thinking out loud.
I would as well. And yeah, I don't know that that's gendered in quite the same way as Aphrodite or Sophia is. And maybe that's good, right? I mean, maybe moving away from some of that those gendered constructions is the ultimate goal. And what we see here is just a sort of antidote to the idea that that the goal is always something masculine, that the arche or the telos on both ends is always masculine. And Socrates he slips back into that in relating Diotima's speech, where he starts to talk about the child, right? Because it's fairly clear that the child that he's talking about is a male child, right? That immortality is attained through this progeny. And I think
just note that you're going to have to break in because we're running pretty close to the time. So,
okay.
Sorry, if you wanted to finish your thought. Sorry.
Yeah. So, and I think that Irigaray sort of rightly calls Socrates out for this, because one of the things that I love about her essay is that she calls out where Socrates sort of slips away from what might seem to be the diatemic message to his own message.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And I'm not sure it'll ever break through my barrier of understanding philosophy, but it puts it in terms that I can understand and get a little bit closer. I really enjoyed that, and I do think there's lots of connections there.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for wonderful questions.